Today I'm lecturing on Marshall McLuhan and Medium is the Message. Before we delve into this work, I would like to introduce myself so that you'll have a better idea of the direction from which I come to McLuhan's ideas. My name is Jason Ellis, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department at City Tech. I teach composition, technical writing, and literature classes. I'm currently teaching ENG 2420, Science Fiction, in which I guide students through the literary history of the genre, beginning with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in 1818 to cyberpunk in the 1980s and 1990s. It's a fun class that combines literature, literary theory, and history, because you can't really understand SF or any literature without looking at its context, or the background, history, and ideas surrounding and connecting to a given story, both in terms of when it was written, as well as how we think about it today. To give you some context about myself, I earned my BS in Science, Technology, and Culture from Georgia Tech in Atlanta, my MA in Science Fiction Studies from the University of Liverpool in England, and PhD in English from Kent State University in Ohio. Supporting my teaching, I researched several interrelated and interdisciplinary fields: human cognition and culture, computers and digital culture, and science fiction, which I think of as the thread connecting those things together. Now that you know a little bit about who's giving today's lecture, let's turn our attention to Marshall McLuhan and the Medium is the Message. Marshall McLuhan, born 1911 and passed away in 1980, was an academic and public intellectual who began his academic career writing about Edgar Allan Poe and teaching rhetoric. But eventually, he upended our ideas about media and their effect on our culture and ourselves. The Jesuit priest and professor of English Walter Ong, who was once a student of McLuhan, tells us, quote, "Above all and in all and through all, Marshall McLuhan was a teacher. All a teacher can ever do is get other people to think. A good teacher is one who can encourage others to think actively. A superior teacher can make the thinking pleasant for the learners. A superb teacher can make thinking an overpowering activity, delightful when it is even when it's disturbing and exhausting." By these criteria, Marshall McLuhan was a superb teacher who could stir people's minds. Even those who found themselves baffled or exasperated generally found themselves changed. End quote. Before McLuhan became a teacher, he transitioned from studying engineering to literature, earning a BA and MA from the University of Manitoba. Then he earned a second BA and a PhD from Cambridge University in England. Ong crossed paths with McLuhan at St. Louis University, a Jesuit institution. If you're not familiar with the Jesuits or the Society of Jesus, they are a Catholic religious order whose members focus on education and scholarship. Also considering a local connection between McLuhan and New York, he taught at Fordham and lived in Bronxville for a while. The reading begins with this passage, quote, "In a culture like ours, long accustomed to splitting and dividing all things as a means of control, it is sometimes a bit of a shock to be reminded that, in operational and practical fact, the medium is the message. This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is an extension of ourselves, results from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology." End quote. Contained in this passage is his aphorism, "The medium is the message." What is an aphorism? It is a concise statement of a principle. Others might call it a logion or a traditional maxim of a religious teacher or sage. The medium is the message means that we should pay attention to how a message is delivered and its effect on people rather than the message itself. Put another way, the message of a medium is not what the medium can do, but what are the effects of that new medium on the individual and society. The effects of the new medium is the message that we should be paying attention to, and not necessarily the content or work done by the medium. Who looked up McLuhan and the medium is the message on Wikipedia? What did it say about the phrase, the medium is the message? It states, quote, "The phrase was introduced in McLuhan's book Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, published in 1964, end quote. I point this out because through my research preparing today's lecture, I found an earlier occurrence using City Tech's library database holdings. In 1959, McLuhan published a journal article titled Myth and Mass Media in the journal Daedalus. He uses the phrase without missing a beat. Quote, another way of getting at this aspect of languages as macromyths, meaning models, is to say that the medium is the message. Only incidentally, as it were, is such a medium a specialized means of signifying or of reference. And in the long run, for such media or macromyths as the phonetic alphabet, printing, photography, the movie, the telegraph, the telephone, radio, and television, the social action of these forms is also, in the fullest sense, their message or meaning. A language is, on the one hand, little affected by the use individuals make of it, but on the other hand, it almost entirely patterns the character of what is thought, felt, or said by those using it. And it can be utterly changed by the intrusion of another language, as speech was changed by writing and radio by television. End quote. Here McLuhan is talking about language as a technology or medium that creates the boundaries of possibility for what can be expressed. The patterns made possible by the language is the message. Others have explored this idea of language as a technology. For example, Salikoko Mufwene's essay, Language as Technology, Some Questions That Evolutionary Linguistics Should Address, redefines language from a natural ability to a technology broadly defined, a system used to get the work of communication done, or to solve the problem of communication with an agreed-upon system of encoding and deciphering sound utterances. He argues that because language is, quote, a means to fulfill a purpose, end quote, and that means, quote, can be knowledge when used to explain or handle something else, practice when extended to the solution of a problem, or science, as in science and technology, when scientific knowledge is applied to develop practical things in order to make our lives easier or to help us solve problems. End quote. All of which are broad definitions for technology. Language is a technology or a means to fulfill a purpose, namely of communication. McLuhan's student, who I mentioned a moment ago, Walter Ong, argues in his essay, Writing is a Technology That Restructures Thought, that the literate mind is fundamentally different than the mind of one who has primary orality, or no knowledge of reading and writing. Once we acquire literacy, or the ability to read and write, we cannot unsee or unthink about words and ideas divorced from literacy. This is the difference between oral and literate cultures. Then, secondary orality is the return to oral culture through literacy with digital technologies. Consider the rise of YouTube, podcasts, game streaming, etc., moving from a literate to digital culture, which we would call a culture of secondary orality. Let's go a little deeper into what a medium means. A medium for McLuhan is simply any technology or an extension of ourselves. It could be a hammer or a light bulb, or it could be movable type and books. McLuhan, however, is more interested in media of communication, especially those that are electrically powered, which he sees as the unifying element of modern media. We can consider language, both spoken and written language, as technologies or media. Mark Fetterman, former chief strategist for the McLuhan Program in Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto, explains further that, quote, the medium of language extends our thoughts from within our mind out to others. Indeed, since our thoughts are the result of an individual sensory experience, speech is an outering of our senses. We could consider it as a form of reversing senses. Whereas usually our senses bring the world into our minds, speech takes our sensorily shaped minds out to the world, end quote. In this case, speech is a medium for expressing our ideas in the world to others to do work to make change. Eric McLuhan, who was a media theorist and collaborator with his father Marshall McLuhan while they were both alive, tells us this about his father, quote, McLuhan argued that the initial content of any new medium is always a pre-existing medium, end quote. For example, radio takes over from newspapers in the music hall. Television incorporates radio and film. The World Wide Web incorporates radio, television, film, newspapers, and magazines. Therefore, studying a medium's content says little or nothing about its formal character or effects. Studying content leads us away from knowledge of the new media form because that content is simply earlier media accreted by the new media. According to Ong, McLuhan taught, quote, "The future is a thing of the past," end quote. He, as others of his generation, began to explore the relationship between the past and present, recognizing that the past and the present are understood only in relation to one another rather than isolated. This approach is called diachronic, or historical, as opposed to a descriptive or synchronic or ahistorical approach. This is true of media too. If new media contains old media, the present and future are determined by the past. If we focus on this content instead of the effects of the new media on human affairs, we miss the point that McLuhan is trying to illuminate for us. McLuhan reminds us that we tend to focus on the obvious. We tend to miss the subtle or slow change taking place around us. McLuhan, quote, tells us to look beyond the obvious and seek the non-obvious changes or effects that are enabled, enhanced, accelerated, or extended by the new thing, end quote, according to Fetterman. For example, a new technology or a new medium is introduced. It could be something disruptive like Facebook or Twitter. We know how it works. We know what are its affordances, meaning the things we can use it for, and its constraints, the things that we can't use it for. But we don't know what its unintended consequences are. We don't know initially how it might change how we think, act, interact with others, etc. These larger consequences of new media are complex and dynamic. They involve everything going on around us. The key is to notice this change, because this change is McLuhan's message. Quote, "The change of scale or pace or pattern that a new invention or innovation introduces into human affairs," end quote. For example, the message of a television newscast isn't the news stories themselves, but the change in public attitudes toward crime or the creation of a climate of fear. The message of Twitter, isn't that one person is pro-MAGA and another is pro-social justice. Instead, the message of Twitter is the fostering of divisions within the body politic through unfettered speech, amplification, and anonymity. It encourages closed-off or siloed conversations instead of rational discourse as imagined by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. A new medium means a new culture. One specific culture that McLuhan is interested in is electronic culture, which was in its infancy during his early work and began to accelerate just before he died with the production of the first personal computers. One culture that has emerged as a result of new computer and telecommunication technologies is what McLuhan calls the global village. He writes in his 1962 book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, that, quote, "The new electronic interdependence recreates the world in the image of a global village," end quote. New communication media speed up the transfer of information and facilitate the sharing of information between peoples in ways that were virtually impossible before. The sharing of this information at an accelerated pace connects us to others who we would not share affinities with before, and the speed of information exchange contracts. It makes us feel that the world is a smaller place than it was 100 years ago. While McLuhan was thinking of the global village before the internet existed, we can look to the latest assemblage of computer and telecommunication systems. 31 years ago, the World Wide Web was inaugurated in March 1989 with Tim Berners-Lee's project proposal that brought together hypertext, a rendering browser, and a server daemon. Using a Next computer, this was the computer company led by Steve Jobs after his ouster from Apple in the mid-1980s and financed in part by Ross Perot, a businessman who ran for president and lost in 1992. So Tim Berners-Lee built a prototype, and the first version went online on 6 August 1991. The World Wide Web and the Internet on which it was accessible went on to change the world. On the one hand, the World Wide Web connected people together to form an even more developed form of McLuhan's global village. And on the other, the technologies that made the World Wide Web and the Internet possible were many different but interconnected older technologies that we might think of as assemblages that, when put together, form a new medium, in this case, the World Wide Web. These ideas were extended by others. For example, the German media theorist Friedrich Kittler teaches us in Gramophone Film Typewriter that all media have always been an important and integral part of discourse, or our larger cultural conversations. Building on McLuhan, he observes that, quote, the content of each medium is another medium, end quote. Our media within media should be considered equally when studying discourse, not only as discourse's record, but also because they determine our situation. They determine our situation because they define what and how discourse is recorded. We study this via discourse networks, or in Kittler's words, quote, the network of technologies and institutions that allow a given culture to select, store, and process relevant data, end quote. The evolution of media is determined by the logic of escalation, or the evolutionary process of technological development, driven by technological innovation, market forces, competition, etc., and not necessarily individual human agency. J. David Bolter of the Georgia Institute of Technology and Richard Grusin of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee argue in their essay titled Remediation that all media tend to operate between two poles, immediacy, or the erasure of the medium, or less apparent, or transparency, and on the other end, hypermediacy, or promotion of the media, or making it more apparent, or opaque, or multiply, or escalate. Immediacy and hypermediacy draw attention to the borrowing and repurposing that new media do of old media. This is called remediation. Remediation is what new technologies do, quote, define itself in relationship to earlier technologies of representation, end quote. The new media borrow from and refashion old media such as painting, photography, radio, television, and film. It can also include technologies underlying the media, such as the vacuum tube and radios were repurposed to make television possible. Their principle is that, quote, all mediation is remediation, end quote. All media exist in relation to other media. Remediation works in both directions. Quote, this attempt shows that remediation operates in both directions. Users of older media such as film and television can seek to appropriate and refashion digital graphics, just as digital graphics artists seek to refashion film and television, end quote. From these examples, you can see how McLuhan's ideas were influential and how others have extended his ideas over time. Returning to McLuhan, he classifies media along a spectrum with oppositions of hot and cool. The journalist Alden Whitman describes these as, quote, a hot medium was one that allows of less participation than a cool one, as a lecture makes for less participation than a seminar, and a book for less than a dialogue, end quote. Hot media have little or no participation. Cool media are much more participatory and interactive. Telephones, text messaging, and video games are cool. Books, radio, and television are hot. A static HTML-based web page is hot, but a web page that loads dynamic content customized for you or facilitates comments between readers is cool. In some of McLuhan's other works, such as his posthumous Laws of Media from 1988, co-authored with his son Eric McLuhan, he gives us tools for studying the effects of media. First, there are the concepts of figure and ground. Let's look at a painting to get an idea about the difference between these two concepts. This is a 1964 painting by Al Held in the Museum of Modern Art. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this painting, what do you think it's called? I'll give you a second. All right, is called the big N. What stood out to you first? What jumps out at us first and grabs our attention is the figure. According to the Communication Institute for Online Scholarship, which has a McLuhan encyclopedia developed in 1998, the ground, quote, supports or contextualizes a situation and is usually an area of unattention, end quote. The ground frames or contextualizes the figure. Once we know the title of the painting, the frame became linked to the figure of the tiny triangle figures. The invisible ground became visible, and we are confronted by a whole new situation. For McLuhan, quote, the medium turns out to be a ground for a figure, end quote. An analogy for figure and ground is weather and climate. We pay attention to weather, but climate is the environment from which weather emerges. McLuhan tells us, quote, all situations comprise an area of attention, figure, and a very much larger area of inattention, ground. The two continually coerce and play with each other across a common outline or boundary or interval that serves to define both simultaneously. The shape of one conforms exactly to the shape of the other. Figures rise out of and recede back into ground, which is configurational and comprises all other available figures at once. For example, at a lecture, attention will shift from the speaker's words to his gestures, to the hum of the lights, or to street sounds, to the feel of the chair, or to a memory or association or smell. Each new figure in turn displaces the others into ground. In the order of things, ground comes first and the figures emerge later. The ground of any technology or artifact is both the situation that gives rise to it and the whole environment, the medium, of services and disservices that it brings into play. These environmental side effects impose themselves willy-nilly as a new form of culture. Once the old ground becomes content of a new situation, it appears to ordinary attention as aesthetic figure. At the same time, a new retrieval or nostalgia is born, end quote. So the ground comes first. This is background noise, what we're used to, the technologies and media that we're accommodated and used to seeing and interacting with. From the ground, new figures come into play out of the ground. These figures are the new culture that come about from new media. The new media retrieve or connect back to the old media in the ground, which we can think about as nostalgia or the recollection of things past through rose-tinted lenses. Eventually, figures recede back into the ground as new figures arise and command our attention and institute a new culture around them. I have two fun analogies to show you. First, on the most basic level, you can think of figure and ground as foreground and background of a picture. It has to do with what we pay attention to. In what I'm displaying now, you can see the Millennium Falcon speeding away from what appears to be a Star Destroyer in a star field in the background. If I switch perspective to focus on the background, the figure of the Millennium Falcon falls out of focus. In a sense, this refocusing on the ground is akin to McLuhan's retrieval and nostalgia. For another analogy that's closer to what McLuhan is talking about has to do with a bucket full of Lego bricks. In the first pane, you just see a jumble of bricks. No one element stands out from the ground. If we imagine a new medium or technology that comes into play, it begins to emerge in the second pane, and then it is easy to see, like the nanosuit Hulk from Avengers Endgame, and we focus on it. The Hulk in this analogy is the figure. We can recognize him and focus on him as separate from the ground of the random Lego bricks. As new media or technologies come about, the Hulk as figure would recede to the ground and those new media would emerge and we would focus on them. The old media wouldn't disappear. Just like the Hulk here, it would still exist in the ground, but it wouldn't be as noticeable or what we focus on. The figure or new media is what we focus on, and a new culture comes about in response to the rise of the figure or new media. For example, the automobile is a figure. While it is a technology that permits people to move around more quickly and easily than it could have done with older technology such as a horse and buggy, it is a figure that depends on a number of services that support its use. These services, highways, gas stations, mechanic shops, factories, refineries, etc., are the ground. In this case, the ground acts as the medium for the figure of the automobile. If we think of a medium as something carrying something else, mediating something else, the supporting services are what make it possible for the car to take us places. But they aren't what we usually think about when we think about cars. We focus on the figure, the automobile itself. For McLuhan, looking at the figure or ground alone doesn't tell you the whole story. The total effect comes from looking at figure and ground together and exploring their relationship to one another. Similarly, Twitter is a figure. It is a technology that permits short bursts of communication in a one-to-many arrangement. Twitter emerges from the ground of the internet. I'm oversimplifying this case because Twitter needs everything that makes the internet possible, including electrical infrastructure, connectivity technology for our devices, etc. Nevertheless, other figures emerge from the ground of the internet, the World Wide Web, Facebook, Snapchat, email, etc. Another tool that McLuhan gives us is the Tetrad, or a group of four things. After we've identified the medium, we can question different aspects of it within these four categories: enhances, retrieves, reversal, and obsolesces. Each quadrant answers a question. Enhances, what does the medium enhance? Retrieves, what does the medium retrieve from older media? Reversal, what does the medium flip into or reverse into when pushed to extremes? Obsolesces, what does the medium make obsolete? Enhances and retrieves are figures, or what is obvious. And reversal and obsolesces are grounds, or what is the context, or the non-obvious. Around the tetrad on the periphery, we can write examples and explanation, or what McLuhan calls the gloss areas. The tetrad might be useful for your thinking about media, including what they do and how they relate to other media. Let's look at some media examples with the tetrad. First, consider the computer. It enhances the speed of calculation and retrieval. It retrieves perfect memory, total and exact. It reverses from order to anarchy via the complexities of bureaucracy. It obsolesces sequence, approximation, perception, and the present. Second, consider the cell phone. It enhances the mobility of communication. It retrieves communication across a distance, the telephone and the two-way radio. It reverses or flips from freedom to a technological leash. It obsolesces telephone landlines and payphones and the beeper or pager. And third, consider Twitter again. It enhances one-to-many communication, interaction at a distance, multimedia composition, and metadata. It retrieves writing, photography, videography, group email, and news groups. It reverses into content without substance, shouting into the void, being alone together, and factual and effective manipulation by influencers and bots alike. It obsolesces text messaging, email, photo, and video sharing, and listserv and email lists. So why was McLuhan so concerned about the effects of media on us? According to Alden Whitman, McLuhan was simply trying to help people control the new media by understanding their effects. McLuhan said in an interview, quote, "By knowing how technology shapes our environment, we can transcend its absolutely determining power. Far from regarding technological change as inevitable, I insist that if we understand its components, we can turn it off any time we choose. Short of turning it off, there are lots of moderate controls conceivable," end quote. And he goes on to say, quote, "A medium is not something neutral. It does something to people," end quote. Then Whitman continues, quote, "McLuhan believed electronic media in particular were shaping people in ways they hardly suspected." And McLuhan adds in his book, Understanding Media, that, quote, "For any medium has the power of imposing its own assumptions on the unwary," end quote. There's one last thing I want to leave you guys with today. It's a passage from a few pages further into the McLuhan excerpt that you read for today's class. I'll read it to you. Quote, C.P. Snow, reviewing a book of A.L. Rouse in the New York Times Book Review, December 24, 1961, on appeasement and the road to Munich, describes the top level of British brains and experience in the 1930s. Quote, their IQs were much higher than usual among political bosses. Why were they such a disaster? End quote. The review of Rouse Snow proves, quote, they would not listen to warnings because they did not wish to hear, end quote. Being anti-red made it impossible for them to read the message of Hitler. But their failure was as nothing compared to our present one. The American state in literacy as a technology or uniformity applied to every level of education, government, industry, and social life is totally threatened by the electric technology. The threat of Stalin or Hitler was external. The electric technology is within the gates, and we are numb, deaf, blind, and mute about its encounter with the Gutenberg technology, on and through which the American way of life was formed. It is, however, no time to suggest strategies when the threat has not even been acknowledged to exist. I am in the position of Louis Pasteur telling doctors that their greatest enemy was quite invisible and quite unrecognized by them. Our conventional response to all media, namely that it is how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiot. For the content of a medium is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. The effect of the medium is made strong and intense just because it is given another medium as content. The content of a movie is a novel or a play or an opera. The effect of the movie form is not related to its program content. The content of writing or print is speech, but the reader is almost entirely unaware either of print or of speech. End quote. What McLuhan's doing here is building an analogy between the Western leaders who attempted to appease Hitler by pressuring Czechoslovakia to cede the Sudetenland areas to Germany in order to avoid a war. The Czechs acquiesced, then Hitler took the whole damn country and subsequently invaded Poland, which kicked off a war that resulted in millions of lives lost in horrific concentration camps and on battlefields. McLuhan, who is very cognizant of the historical importance of this, points out that the threat posed by unchecked media is already within the gates, and it poses a threat to the American way of life. When I was reading this passage, I was thinking about Twitter and other social media platforms in the 2016 election in the United States and Brexit in the United Kingdom. These were two seismic events in our recent history that were influenced in some ways by social media, and the effects of those events will have lasting ramifications for both peoples and people all around the world. The only way that we can ensure a just and equal future is to figure out what our media are doing to us and leverage our media to support those goals and ward against the goals of those who would desire to restrict freedom and foster inequality. Thank you for listening to my lecture on Marshall McLuhan and the medium is the message. Be well and good luck.